So I'm going to turn it over to you, Elizabeth.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Elizabeth O'Neill. I work currently as an independent consultant, but I've been doing assessments of conservation programs since the early 2000s. I know many of you, I'm sure. I worked at CI for many years. I was the evaluation director for WWF International for a couple of years, led on evaluation for the Moore Foundation for a while, and my clients now tend to include WWF programs, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Jane Goodall, the Moore Foundation, you name it. I've probably assessed your organization's program if it's working in the international space, either directly or through a portfolio or funder evaluation. So what I am going to share with you today are just some thoughts on pragmatic tips for evaluating conservation programs. So this isn't a comprehensive primer on how to do evaluation. My main goal here is to make evaluation a little more approachable and to encourage those considering doing evaluation or supporting programs who need to have evaluations done, or people who lead programs, to encourage you to take very realistic approaches to this, to encourage you to realize that evaluation can happen in many, many forms and should be happening all the time, and that it is possible to do that and do that with some great credibility. So that's what I'm going to cover today. I have a couple of questions to start with. Oh, now my screen's frozen. That's great. We had it all set up.
Is that on your end or our end, Elizabeth? Oh, there we go.
There we go. Okay. So in the, to start out with, I'm wondering from this crowd, and I'd just like to hear from a few of you just to get a sense of who's on the line. When you hear the word evaluation, how do you feel? What do you think? And if you could tell us your name, your organization, your role within your organization, and then respond to the question, it would be great to hear from you. You're also welcome to include your responses in the chat box, and Sarah can read those out. So when you hear the word evaluation, how do you feel? What do you think? Are we unmuted, Sarah?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
This is Charles from the Nature Conservancy of Canada. When I hear evaluation, I think of improvements, potential improvements.
Great. Other thoughts?
This is Claire Crawford from WWF UK, and when I hear the word Head of Design and Impact, when I hear the word of evaluation, I think, okay, there's a lot of work we're going to have to do to make this one land. However good the evaluator might be, I'm aware of the amount of work that we're going to have to be engaged in.
Right. Hi, Claire. Nice to hear you.
It's good to hear your voice too.
Kent Pryor speaking.
Again.
Hey, I'm with Parks Canada in Gatineau, Quebec, and when I hear that question, I think we need more of it. Not easy, but we need more of it.
Great. And then if a couple of other people could chime in, what were you hoping to learn today? I'd just like to get a sense of why you've joined.
Hi, this is Donnell Keach with the Nature Conservancy in Maryland.
Hi, Donnell.
Live, hi. I'd really like to feel more confident that when I undertake an evaluation that I'm actually going to be able to ensure that it's used to make decisions and improve programs.
Great.
And this is Claire again from the UK. I think that what I'm interested in is the fact that you call this a pragmatic evaluation, and really I want to know is what do we have to do to ensure that an evaluation is good enough for us to inform decisions without taking over and really something that can enable teams to benefit.
Great.
This is Janet from the Gwich'in Renewable Resources Board in Inuvik, Northwest Territories. How would you know if you're successful? You know, so if you have program objectives, how can you tell that you've achieved them?
Great. Thanks. All right, great. Thank you, everyone. It's really helpful to me just to hear from you and why you've joined. Sarah, how many folks do we have on the call now? Just to get a sense of who I'm talking to.
Yeah, let me see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I can't count them all, but looking at this, it looks like around 30 people.
Oh, great. Fantastic. Well, I'm glad there's so much interest. Okay, great. And we could probably mute everyone's lines then, and I'll move on. Okay, so hopefully, I think this presentation will address most of your interests. I wanted to start just with a little bit of background. So first I would note that evaluation is done less in conservation than other sectors in my experience. So working at the Moore Foundation, for example, which also works on health and science, working with other organizations that work on education, for example, or development, you see much stronger evaluation practice across most other sectors. There are some highlights within our community as well. NICWA, for example, very consistently does evaluations. Some WWF offices also consistently do evaluation. You heard from Claire at WWF UK. They commission evaluations quite regularly. U.S. Fish Africa has started doing a number of evaluations over the last few years. And then obviously an array of funders. And that's often where the push within our sector comes from to do evaluation. Most of these, I would note, are external independent evaluation. And I want to be clear right here up front that that's not all I'm talking about. So when I talk about evaluation, I'm talking about using credible information to answer key questions around design, management, and performance. And anyone could be doing that. You could be doing it at your desk, or it could be an external independent evaluation, or it could be somewhere in between. One of the main points I want to make to you all, and you'll hear me say this a few times in the presentation, is that we need to move away from equating the term evaluation and the practice of evaluation with only external independent evaluation. What I'm talking about is bringing evaluative practice more consistently into our sector. Part of the reason for that is that our reliance on external independent evaluations, those tend to be pretty intensive, expensive, and externally led. They're often expert opinion-based versus true evidence-based objective analysis. So we hire folks that have experience in the sector or in the particular area of work that we're evaluating, but they don't necessarily have strong evaluation experience. They're often commissioned by and therefore for someone else. So when a program is being evaluated, often that is being required by a funder versus the program itself saying, hey, we need to do or commission a great check-in on our performance to help us to improve. So what I would like to encourage through this presentation is that program teams, monitoring and evaluation staff, funders can do more to A, do more evaluations better, and B, to ensure programs themselves get the most out of them. Ultimately, although I do a lot of external independent evaluation, my thought in my mind, as someone said, is how do we ensure that this exercise ultimately is really useful to the program itself? Because ultimately it falls to the program to adopt the recommendations to do the day-to-day work. So an evaluation can help a funder to make decisions about how to allocate resources, but ultimately the richness of any evaluative process really first and foremost should be targeted to the program as the audience. So in this presentation, I'm going to give some tips and tricks around deciding why you're evaluating, what you're evaluating, deciding on your evaluation approach, determining your data and information needs, and then I'll summarize some key points. Again, these are general steps. and tips. This isn't a comprehensive guide. There actually are not really any great comprehensive guides for evaluation in our sector. The only one I know of, trying not to toot my own horn, is the set of evaluation guidelines of the WWF network, which I developed with several other evaluation leads across the network, gosh, about 5 years ago. And that's a pretty comprehensive guide and quite useful. So if you'd really like details on evaluation and how to go about commissioning one, designing one, doing one, that's really going to be your best resource that I know of. If folks know of other great resources or guides, maybe you could drop those into the chat box. And again, this presentation assumes evaluations range from an internal evaluative practice to externally commissioned evaluations. So why should we evaluate? And hopefully those of you who work on evaluation are familiar with this. But the main thing when you're launching an evaluation or designing, you really need to decide up front, why are we doing this? There are three main reasons why evaluations are done. First is to enhance effectiveness of ongoing efforts. Second is to enhance accountability, credibility, transparency. And the third is to improve overall impact by drawing key lessons for broader programmatic, organizational, or sectoral learning. Now, often when evaluations are commissioned, say by a funder, a lot of the questioning and focus is around accountability. Are they doing what we gave them money to do? And is it working? But from a programmatic standpoint, you really need to go beyond that, right, and think about effectiveness. And from a sectoral and organizational standpoint, you really need to think about capturing broader learning. Regardless of your reasons, they should be defined by intended audiences right up front, and foremost among these, again, should be the program. They should be involved in setting the terms of reference for the evaluation. Now, that often isn't the case when it's commissioned by headquarters or a funder. But again, if you really want it to be a useful exercise, you want the evaluated program to be engaged and to benefit, they really ought to be involved in defining those reasons. So what to evaluate? So first, we all know how we work. I'm not going to show you the traditional open standards donut just yet. I'm going to use a different portrayal here. So how do we work? Initially, we typically identify the conservation values that we are trying to, the program that's being evaluated is trying to maintain. We figure out what's affecting those values, and then we figure out what we're going to do about it, right? So what is our strategic approach? So we tend to plan from conservation values down to strategic approach, and we tend to implement strategic approach, hoping that the effects of our work will then influence the situation that is affecting the conservation values that we're focusing on. So when we evaluate, we're evaluating all across those chains, ideally, to consider whether what's being done is actually having the desired results on situation and ultimately on conservation values. And then ideally we use the information from evaluation to adapt plans and to adapt implementation. In terms of a generic results chain, the conservation values or conservation targets we reframe typically as goals, particularly for following the open standards. So desired targeted changes in status of conservation targets and in some cases human beneficiaries. So we evaluate the impacts of a program. We evaluate the outcomes of a program, also referred to as objectives, whether or not key factors have changed in the way that the program is seeking to change them, and by those I mean threats, drivers, or specific strategic objectives. We evaluate outputs, so the actual products and services of the program or organization, and we evaluate inputs typically, so, or at least we want to capture what human and financial resources have been invested in order to produce the outputs that ideally are triggering the outcomes and ultimately the impacts sought by the program. A critical aspect of evaluation is assessing attribution. Really, when you talk about impacts or outcomes, the results of the strategies or the results of the evaluated program, You want to look at whether the inputs that have been invested, the outputs that have been delivered, are bringing about those results, right? So impact isn't just whether or not the status of a target has changed. Impact is whether or not the status of that target has changed as a result of the efforts of the program. So when we evaluate, we have to assess all across the chain in order to determine that. Now, I say that, I'm using the word attribution. The reality is, in our sector, as in many other sectors, determining true attribution is not possible. It's too complicated. There are too many other actors. It's usually the programs themselves aren't designed in a way that you even know what their theories of change are in any detail up front. This is still the case across our sector. So it's difficult to even know what the intended relationships or results chain was meant to be up front. So, you know, ideally you at least get to some level of correlation. Well, they did these things and we saw these positive changes, and there's reason to think that those changes are at least partially a result of this program's efforts. That's usually about as far as you can get in my experience. Nonetheless, if you want to have a sense of attribution, or if the commissioning funder, organization, whomever is asking you, we want to know what our money produced, you do have to look across the whole chain. So what to evaluate? So that's in terms of the general results chain. Typically, when we think about what do we want to evaluate, many evaluations are shaped around a set of industry standard evaluation criteria that we have adopted in our sector, but that are also used across other sectors, including principally development poverty alleviation. And these are in the WWF guidelines, for example. We shape around these, and many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with these. So we evaluate on relevance. Is the strategic plan likely to have desired outcomes and ultimate impacts? Is it the best course of action? One thing I always look at when I evaluate a program is the question of necessity as well as sufficiency. So is what the program doing necessary to bring about the ultimate outcomes and impacts? And not only that, but if you look at the sum total of what they're doing, is it sufficient to actually catalyze the changes in critical threats, in the status of biodiversity, in the state of human well-being? Very often programs fall down on the question of sufficiency. If they are working with one of 20 communities that are unsustainably harvesting resources from a forest, and ultimately the idea is state change of that forest, well, that's going to be an insufficient program. Certainly what they're doing is necessary, but an insufficient approach. So when I look at relevance, I often look at that question. The other thing I tend to incorporate in relevance is a basic conservation audit. So I tend to look at whether or not the program is following the best design and management practices for conservation, which in our sector and in this community especially, we look to the open standards or organizational equivalents of the open standards. So I always look at, you know, do they have SMART goal and objective statements? Do they have results chains or some other articulation of theory of change? Are they collecting monitoring data that is relevant to those goals and objectives? So I usually do a high-level conservation audit within this criterion. And this is once again freezing up. Let's see. Oh, it's funny. When I make the WebEx box small, it won't let me drive my computer anymore. WebEx. We also typically look at the criterion of effectiveness. To what extent have our outcomes, targeted changes in understanding behavior, key conditions been changed or been achieved? Are those changes a result of our efforts? Effectiveness and impact, these tend to be used, these terms tend to be used really loosely within our sector. Ideally, we're going to move to a place where we use these more consistently with how they're more broadly understood. So effectiveness is really looking at changes in those intermediate factors in the situation that is affecting our conservation values. Impact really, when we talk about impact, ideally we need to move to a place where we're really talking about whether those ultimate changes are happening in the state of biodiversity, in the state of human well-being. Impact should not be used to describe every effect that a program has in the world, which is often how it's used in our sector. But really what we should be talking about is that ultimate change. And again, effectiveness and impact isn't just whether we're seeing those changes, it's whether they're occurring as a result of the work of the program itself. Efficiency, the relationship between our outputs and outputs, are we getting desired return on investment? Especially in the UK, there have been pretty elaborate methods developed for assessing ROI. Usually the data you need to do that are not available within conservation programs. It's very difficult to do that in a rigorous way. But I still, in my evaluations, because everybody wants to know this ultimately, I usually do ultimately have conclusions that say, well, the program spent this and they achieved this, and does that or does that not seem like good return on investment? So I usually will make kind of qualitative statements around that, and I encourage the programs I work with to think about that as well. Sustainability, is it likely that positive results of the program will continue after effort ends? And when we developed the WWF guidelines, we also included the question of adaptive capacity. Are we applying effective adaptive management practice? This can be assessed. This is basically looking at the design and M&E practice of the program. As I said, I normally now include that in my assessment of relevance versus a separate criterion. So just looking at those criteria against the generic results chain, relevance looks all across the chain. Does it make sense? Is it following good logic? Impact obviously looks at the far right side of the chain. Effectiveness looks at delivery or attainment of planned outcomes or objectives, as well as major outputs. Efficiency looks at the relationship, as I talked about. Sustainability looks at whether or not the outcomes and impacts are likely to be sustained even if the program were to end. And then adaptive capacity looks at the whole shebang of design and management practice. Another approach, so in terms of figuring out what to evaluate, how are we going to structure this evaluation, what are our focal questions that will guide the analysis. But depending on the program or the approach that I'm using, sometimes I'll use this simplified framework of what, so what, now what. So the what is, what did we set out to achieve, what did we do toward those aims. So what did we actually get done, so what changes did we actually catalyze as far as we can tell. So what changes in state of key factors or targets or beneficiaries have occurred. So what worked about what we did and what didn't work about what we did. And then now what? Based on that whole analysis, what we did, so what was accomplished, what has changed in context, now what do we think we should do to make this program better? This is a great framework to use if you are facilitating a self-evaluation of a program, or if you yourself are in a program and you say, you know what, you guys, we need to step back and really think about how things are going and what we need to improve. This is a really useful framework. Everybody gets it. So if you sit in a room with a team using those 6 evaluation criteria I presented previously, they're more nuanced, they're more kind of techie or specific to evaluation, where this framework, everybody understands it, and I find this to be very useful. So once you've decided why you're doing the evaluation, what your focal questions are for the evaluation, you need to decide on your evaluation approach. So again, like I said at the start, I really want to emphasize that evaluation does not necessarily have to mean external independent evaluation. In fact, when I was at the Moore Foundation, and I entered as the interim evaluation director, and I looked around at the evaluative practice there in the organization, most of what they had been doing was commissioning external independent evaluation. And even at one of the largest foundations in the world, their internal evaluative practice was really missing. And this is consistent, right? We see this in our own organizations, across the conservation sector, as well as across our funders. Because so much emphasis has been placed on EIEs, And so what I encourage there and what I encourage with every program or organization I work with is that they really consider moving investment away from just doing EIEs to strengthening internal evaluative culture and practice. And the reality is when you ask folks within the conservation sector, to what extent are you sitting down and thinking about or going beyond thinking about, am I raising money, spending money, and doing things, to think about whether those things I'm doing are bringing about the changes in the world that I seek to affect. I get mixed responses to this. Usually this is happening in everyone's head at their desk every day to some extent. But what we tend to be held accountable to and what we tend to collect data on in the conservation sector is raising money, spending money, and doing things, right? That's what appears in the donor report. That's the accountability. Now I'm getting an echo.
Yeah,
maybe make sure everyone is muted. So there we go. That's good. So it does happen organically, right? Yeah, people are doing this. The question is moving to stronger evaluative practice is whether or not you're using good information around structured evaluation and learning questions to guide that thinking and process. And that tends to be happening much less. I don't know how many times I've sat down with teams and asked them these higher level questions around outcomes and impact and attribution, and ask them, when was the last time you all sat together and asked yourselves questions at this level? And very often they'll say, this isn't really something we've done. I worked with a program recently that had been running for 15 years, and they said, you know, we don't think we've ever really done this in this way. So evaluation is not just commissioning an external process. Evaluation is having structured evaluation and learning questions and using data on a regular basis to answer those questions as best you can. That's how I encourage all of us to think about it. Now, people who are really devout about evaluation and very experienced are probably cringing on the phone right now thinking, oh God, what's she doing? But if we're going to do this more in our sector, we have to bring it down to something that is more doable, more manageable, and we have to really focus in on why we're doing it. We're not doing it to have an external independent sign-off. I mean, sometimes we are, right? But really, the reasons that so many people said is that we're doing it to improve programs, first and foremost, to learn and improve our sector. And so for those aims to be realized, we need to bring it more into programs' everyday practice. So beyond EIEs, programs can do self-assessments with their teams through reflection meetings, following the what, so what, now what, for example. Facilitated self-assessment is a really effective way to help a team go through an evaluative analysis because you can really hold them to those questions and you can really hold them to justification and evidence-based. You know, what do you think and why do you think that? Peer plus independent evaluation teams can be a great way to do evaluations, and if you have peers of a program involved in the team, often the results will resonate more strongly with the program. They'll feel like, oh, this isn't some random person that's parachuted in to do this evaluation. This is somebody who really knows the kind of thing we're dealing with. And then, of course, there's external independent evaluation. As I said, the key is to use best available evidence to answer evaluative questions on a regular basis. So this presentation will be posted somewhere, I'm sure. This is a sample self-evaluation exercise with a team where you just write down a couple of goals and objectives, answer the questions below, which I've tried to frame in very kind of pragmatic terms, in terms that anybody should be able to answer. Assigning a rating, for example, poor, fair, good, don't know. Writing a brief justification for those answers, and talking them through as a team. This is a pretty straight, this could be done in a couple of hours with the whole team in the room. You don't need an external independent evaluator to do this for the program itself. And then based upon those answers, the team should talk about what can we improve to strengthen our strategic design, to strengthen our delivery of our plan objectives. When I ask programs to sit down and I say, okay, are the elephants better off that you're focused on? And they'll say, well, we think so. And they'll say, well, why? Well, we did some population studies, et cetera. And I say, well, are they better off as a result of what you're doing? Well, we think so, or why? So there is a way to do this. I mean, and programs I find tend to be their own worst critics. I think it's okay to move away from EIEs and to do more facilitated assessment with programs, because I find they tend to be pretty hard on themselves, honestly. They tend to be very analytical about their work and very critical of their work if they have a safe space to do that analysis. So if HQ of an organization or a funder is saying, hey, we need an evaluation of this program, one of the first things I do is try to get a sense of the extent to which I can incorporate participatory process into the analysis. Because I think you get some of the best information you can get from the programs, and they get the most out of it. So when to evaluate? So now the green donut is appearing. I tend to talk about an adaptive management cycle. In my work, that's a little bit simpler than the OS cycle. So I talk about plan, do, assess, adapt, which I've overlaid on top of the green donut. It's all the same when it comes to it in the end. But I would say when to evaluate, follow the open standards. There's great guidance in there about designing, monitoring, and evaluation right up front within program design, and then implementing that plan, monitoring, and evaluation throughout the life of the program. Evaluation, evaluative questioning is integral to the entire adaptive management process. It should not be an isolated or after-the-fact step in design and management. I mean, usually, in my experience, when I get commissioned to do an evaluation, it's a programmatic midterm evaluation. Everybody kind of knew it was coming, but there was no planning for it, no preparation. Very often, the very first thing I have to do with a program is help them to articulate their intended theory of change, because that doesn't exist. And that's what I usually evaluate against. So the more we can plan for this right up front, the better these exercises will be. And evaluative analysis should be done regularly. Valuable evaluative questioning can happen every year through team processes, facilitated processes. It's just the periodicity of evaluative questioning depends on the nature of the question. Impact, for example, where you really need to look at, has the status of conservation targets changed, and is that a result of this program? Well, you're not going to see usually change in the status of targets at any kind of meaningful resolution for maybe 2, 3, 4 years, depending on what you're dealing with. Effectiveness, where you're looking at progress on outcomes as opposed to full attainment, you can look at effectiveness every year. Efficiency, you can look at every year. What did we spend in terms of human and financial resources? To what extent did we move the needle on key factors? And how do we feel about that relationship? Evaluation should be planned well in advance, whether it's going to be an internal exercise or external. I can't tell you how many RFPs I received. In fact, I would say 9 times out of 10, when I receive an evaluation RFP, it is for an exercise that is going to be conducted in the next month or the next 2 months. Qualified evaluators, people you really want to be doing that work for you, are probably not going to be available. If somebody's like, yep, I'm free, you have to question, why are they free? why do they not have work lined up already for next month? Why has nobody already hired them? Same thing if you're going to do an internal analysis. You need to give people time to pull information together, to plan your facilitation, to plan the process, to ensure the right people can participate. And look, evaluation shouldn't be a surprise. You know, this is something that you can easily say, we need to do this every year, every 2 years. That means it's going to logically fall in November, because then we have to submit our donor reports in January, whatever it is. But ideally, you know, start planning an evaluation 6 months in advance. If you are commissioning an EIE as opposed to an internal process, As I said, make sure the program is involved in the TOR process. If you are running a conservation organization or program, I would really encourage you to start pushing back on your funders that are requiring evaluations and encouraging them to bundle evaluations. So if you know that the WWF office is giving you money plus the EU plus Cargill are all going to want evaluations at some point, encourage them to co-fund and co-design a single evaluation to reduce the burden that's placed on the evaluated program itself. I've had program directors, managers in field programs tell me that they spend 50 to 75% of their time on donor requirements, proposals, reporting, donor visits, evaluative processes. This is a huge time suck in our sector. And if we could push back at least on these exercises, and ideally, as some of us have talked about for a long time, encouraging funders to accept common funding reports or grant reports. This would really help to free up time for the folks on the ground to do the business of conservation. Where possible, ensure approaches include facilitated self-assessment, participation, reflection. Programs should push back on poor timing and excessive information or duration requests. Evaluators and those commissioning evaluations can get really caught up in their own exercise without thinking about how is this impacting the program itself in terms of their ability to focus on their work. So that should always be considered. Make sure that evaluator selection, that it's a qualified evaluator, not just someone who will give an expert opinion. A qualified evaluator should be systematic, structured, focus on the key questions, focus on gathering data and evidence to answer those questions, using those data, and providing an objective analysis, not just something that's based on what they think based on their own history. Anticipate, gather, and manage evaluation data and information, and ensure the evaluator gives summary presentations to the evaluated program, both of preliminary findings to get feedback, to do a reality check, a fact check, and also the final results of an evaluation. I find presentations are more likely to convey the results of an evaluation to the program and other key audiences than the report. And often, as many of you know, evaluation reports can be 50, 100, 150 pages. Most folks don't have the time to read that. So make sure that the evaluator provides a synthetic presentation or an evaluation summary. At a minimum, the evaluation report should include a great executive summary up front so that folks can digest the results. I'm trying to move a little faster here because I realize we started a little late and we're running out of time. So I'm going to try to buzz through these. So what data do you need to support an evaluation? The first point I want to make here is that a perfect monitoring plan and perfect monitoring data, having those in hand, are not prerequisites to doing evaluation. Often evaluation doesn't happen, and when I say ask, well, why are you not going through a process of evaluative questioning? Well, we don't have the data we need, we haven't been able to collect it. In my opinion, that doesn't matter. It's much more important to get the program or an organization in the groove of going full cycle, getting in a practice of evaluative questioning, pushing for those higher level questions of outcome and impact attainment and attribution. Better to get going around that cycle than to invest tons of energy in having perfect monitoring data, perfect plan. So what I encourage is that the programs and organizations try to get in the groove of going full cycle as best you can with best available information, whether that's in everybody's head, whether there's some stuff documented, whether there have been some studies or not, and get everybody going around the cycle and worry about improving quality of evidence over time. So every time you go through an evaluative analysis with a program, you're going to see, here, there's good data to support answering these key questions, and here that there's not. And when you say here that we don't have the data we need, well, that then goes into refinement of the monitoring plan and monitoring activities. So not having those data, though, should not preclude doing evaluation. We tend to talk about M&E, and another thing I encourage is thinking about M4E. So any monitoring approach should be designed around those key strategic and management questions that are asked in an evaluative exercise or an external evaluation practice. So it's really important in the program design, in design of the M&E approach, to define those questions up front. What do we want to be asking and answering on a regular basis? The traditional approach of developing a results chain, from there defining your goals and objectives, indicators for each goal and objective, defining data needs by indicator, collecting data needs by indicator, will be insufficient to answer the array of strategic and management questions that I highlighted earlier. For example, if you're talking about efficiency and you want to know basic return on investment, to answer that question, you need to not only know the results of the program, whether or not there is progress being made on outcomes and impacts, but also what that program is investing. That's a different kind of monitoring that often does not appear in a monitoring plan, because the plan focuses on the conservation side of the program. But as a manager or as a funder, you really want to understand what was invested, what were the results, and what is the relationship between them. So that's what's really critical, to define those design or management and evaluative questions right up front, and think about, well, what data would we need to answer those questions, and that's what we need to be collecting and using over time. I've gone through this. So in terms of the generic results chain, what then to monitor and assess, you need to track status of targets and beneficiaries. At the outcome level, you need to track the status of key factors that the program is seeking to influence. At the output level, you need to be tracking whether or not deliverables are being produced as planned, products, in some cases activities, and you need to be tracking inputs in order to answer that full array of evaluative questions that I highlighted. Plus, usually you want to be doing some ambient monitoring. How is context changing? And that will play a big role in answering questions around strategic relevance in design, for example. Because plans are usually developed several years ahead of time, they're implemented, and then by the time an evaluation rolls around, things have really changed, particularly in developing country context. For example, you have administrative change at the presidential level, the cabinet, and everything's different. So there needs to be some degree of ambient monitoring, tracking critical changes in context. Third point around what monitoring data are needed to support evaluation. If you don't know where you've come from, you won't know how far you've gotten. I run into this problem all the time that I'm evaluating programs that have no articulation of baseline. What did it look like when you started? Because if you don't have that, then you can't assess what is the extent to which things have changed. So really encourage programs to document baseline at the start. We all know this is an open standard. It's very rare that it's done. I would say even if that baseline is qualitative, there should be some articulation right up front of the state of key factors, the state of targeted biodiversity, so that then when evaluation comes around, whether it's internally led, externally led, there is the ability to say, oh yeah, when we started this 3 years ago, this is what it looked like, and here's what we think it looks like today, and did it change or didn't it? I'm going to skip these things. So just to get us to have at least 10 minutes for questions and comments. So key points. So first, the why. Evaluation is typically done for accountability, improved impact, and learning. Most importantly, when you're launching into an evaluation exercise, the targeted audiences for that evaluation should decide on that purpose. Why is this happening? And the evaluated program itself should be integral to that discussion and should have a say in what they would like to get out of the evaluation. Then what to be evaluated, define the evaluation questions, what do you want to or need to know. This tends to be a really challenging part of the process typically. Usually when the questions are defined, there are dozens and dozens of them. And so a first step really should be whittling down, prioritizing what's most fundamental here, what would be most helpful to the program and those who are supporting and guiding the program. How can evaluations be done? Again, this can be done at your desk with your team, to an externally facilitated process, to a peer-led process, to externally commissioned independent evaluation. If you're going with an EIE, if you're commissioning it, if you're doing it, remember those various tips that I laid out to make sure that the program gets the most out of it and it's really the most productive exercise it can be. How, with regard to monitoring, remember to design monitoring based upon data needs to answer evaluative questions, including baseline. There's no point in collecting data that will not be needed to answer those key questions. So really data collection, monitoring design should be around those focal questions, not through a derivative process of goal and objective definition, indicator articulation, and data for indicators. Ultimately, all that will get you is an assessment of state change of key factors and targets that won't actually be enough to answer any of your evaluative questions. When should evaluation be done? It should be planned right within the program design at the start. It needs to be scheduled, so ideally it's in the program schedule that evaluation will be done, again, internally, externally, whatever, and then it needs to be done. At a minimum, encourage program teams to set it a half day aside every 6 months, annually, to sit down and push to answer those higher level questions of outcome, impact, attribution, and using evidence to answer those questions, and iterate. So more important to go full cycle, plan, do, assess, adapt on a regular basis, then develop the world's best M&E plan that is not utilized. And this is what I see more often than not. There are M&E plans and no monitoring or evaluative activities in conservation programs. So that's what I've got. That was a lot of ground to cover. There are a bunch of questions coming in. I hope that was more or less what you were hoping to get, at least somewhat, out of this presentation. And now I think Sarah will probably toss some questions at me. I see them popping up.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. That was very instructive to me, and I think to everyone. There are indeed a few questions in the chat box. And I think I'll just go ahead with the first couple. And if everyone is unmuted now, if you'd like to jump in. I know this can be tricky with as many people as we have. But I'll give those in the chat box the first shot at it. So we do have a question about how can you evaluate processes at a low cost? So does an impact evaluation have to be, how can you do it without all the bells and whistles, I guess?
Without all the bells and whistles. Okay. So first, let's be really clear that impact evaluation, capital I, capital E, is a very specific thing. An impact evaluation really does get into attribution. It tends to require significant data and evidence to assess of what's being done. Is it bringing about desired changes in situation and in the status of ultimate targets and beneficiaries? It tends to be a very rigorous process. If you really need to know, without question, is this program bringing about desired impact? I would say it's quite difficult to do that low cost or simply. Again, though, that should not preclude doing an analysis where you work with programs and other key informants and stakeholders to ask, do we see change in state of ultimate targets, and how do we know? And if we're seeing change, do we think that's because of what's being done by this program? Anybody can do that. You can do that in a room with a program team. And I would say I see that happening rarely. And even if we started doing that more, it would really help us in our sector. And that can be done very low cost and very quickly. So at a minimum, you know, you're tracking the status of conservation targets. as best as can be done with available resources, so that you have good data and information at least on how they're doing. But like I've said, I think you can do a lot of this in a room, asking people to pull what they know from their heads, but pushing them to ask those higher level questions around outcome and impact and how do we know.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And at some level, first you need to decide what level of evaluation. You know, do you really need the full-blown impact assessment, or can you, you know, do a more scaled-back version that just gets at what you really need, given where you are in your program. Dan Solder has a question. What's your sense of the trend of using formal evaluation processes, including internal or external independent evaluators in the conservation sector? Is that an increasing trend? At the beginning you said it's not done that commonly in conservation versus other nonprofits. Is that changing?
When evaluation is done within our sector, it's typically external independent evaluation, in my opinion. Because I always ask programs, are you guys asking these kinds of questions yourselves on a regular basis? Do you get together and do this? And most often they say no. We tend to punt. We tend to leave it to external independent evaluation to do this. The extent to which these are happening, are there more, are there less? It really depends on the organization. Some don't do structured evaluation almost at all, where others have a pretty regular practice. As I said, NIFWIF, WWF UK tend to have a much more regular evaluative practice. I would say it's organization dependent. I don't know that there's really a trend one way or the other, but I would say I still today consistently do not see good monitoring and evaluation happening in the part of our sector I work in, which is largely international programming across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So whether or not things are changing in Canada or Australia, I'm afraid I don't know, although what I know from colleagues is that there seems to be better practice in those areas than around the equatorial belt.
Interesting. I just wanted to share, if folks are not following the chat box, Matt has posted some helpful guidance for those working in the U.S. with U.S. government foreign assistance, some monitoring and evaluation guidelines from the Office of Management and Budget. Thank you, Matt, for posting that link. I'm sure that'll be helpful. Another question from Judy about the role of evaluation in understanding theory success or failure, that is evidence of the relationships between outcomes and inputs, I guess. So, you know, if you think of our results change or theory of change as sort of a hypothesis, what's the extent to which evaluation is helping to test those hypotheses, and does that then get fed back into the community so that we learn what works and what doesn't work?
So, as I said, any evaluation exercise should start with looking at the theory of change of the program, and if that doesn't exist, which very often it doesn't, again, in the programs I work with, very often it doesn't in a very cogent way. Often there are long proposals and things, but really, you know, what were the ultimate changes you sought to affect? What action did you take to do that? What were your assumptions in between about why that strategy would work? Often that's missing, and that's the first step in evaluation, is to work with a program to articulate that and then evaluate against that. When I said, you know, a lot of evaluations are expert-led, I would say that's one of the gaps in practice that I see when I see experts hired versus evaluators hired. Evaluators really should be and will typically focus in on the theory of change and assessing against that. Expert opinion-based exercises, they'll kind of go around and look at some documents and ask a lot of questions and then tell you what they think about whether or not the program's doing what it ought to be doing. So where evaluation is done as evaluation, I would say the whole point of it is to assess against the theory of change and to test that logic. Now, whether or not learning from evaluation is getting back into our community, I would say largely no. Again, most of these are external independent evaluations. We as evaluators are not allowed to share the results typically. I have been able to encourage some organizations to share at least summaries of evaluations. The more foundations started doing that in the last several years. All the U.S. fish evaluations I do, those obviously are in the public space. But others are held very close, and it's very hard to get that learning out, which is unfortunate. And that's another reason why to encourage a lot of participation in evaluative processes and to think about internal process versus external, because in an externally led exercise, the person who benefits and learns the most will be the evaluator. So the more you can encourage participation, the more you're going to get the results and learning more broadly into the program and the sector more widely.
Yeah, great. Well, we have bumped up against our time, unfortunately, although we do have a few more questions in the chat box. Elizabeth, is it okay if folks who still had burning questions they really want to ask, can they drop you an email at your address there?
Absolutely. Anytime. I've been a member participating in the Conservation Measures Partnership in one capacity or another for the last 15 years. And I'm now, the dreaded external consultant, and this is how I make my living. But really my core mission is to advance better design, adaptive management, evaluative practice across our sector. And I'm always happy to answer questions, to advise, to help you think through an evaluation you're anticipating. I can help you find evaluators. So feel free to contact me to help you to advance your evaluative practice within your organizations or your own work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was a great presentation and very helpful. And thanks everybody who joined. Again, this session was recorded and we'll be holding another session this evening. So anyone you know who might be interested that you'd like to point them towards this presentation, we will be sharing the link to the recording, and yeah, you can also join, or they can join later this evening. So
yeah. One more request, actually. So I'm doing this presentation again later today, but as Sarah said, we're also organizing a session at the rally. If you have feedback for me on things I didn't cover or things I covered that didn't work for you, please send me feedback on this presentation so we can build that in and adapt this so that the rally session is really effective. So please do send me feedback.
Great suggestion. Thanks, Elizabeth.
For your presentation. That's great, Elizabeth.
Hi, Dan. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Christina.
Thank you very much. Very interesting and useful. Thanks.